Arch Disability Law Center presents Finding and Using Accessibility Regulations.
Hi everyone, my name's Carrie and I'm here with Rachel. We're lawyers. We work at Arch Disability Law Center. Arch works on disability rights law. With us today is Melanie Marsden Myers, who also works at Arch.
We want to welcome you to our video series. It is about the Accessible Canada Act. The Act is law in Canada. It became law in 2019. These 5 videos explain what the Accessible Canada Act is and how it works. They describe how accessibility rules are made under the Act. This information will help people with disabilities and deaf people get involved with the work that comes with this Act. There are many other regulations that are not called accessibility rules, but they still affect people with disabilities and deaf people. It is important for people with disabilities and deaf people to get involved in making these regulations too. The information in this video can help you understand how to do this. We made these videos with the help of our partners. Our partners are the Canadian Association of the Deaf, Communication Disabilities Access Canada, the Council of Canadians with Disabilities, the National Coalition of People Who Use Guide and Service Dogs in Canada, and People First of Canada. In this video series, we will call the Accessible Canada Act the Act for short.
There are 5 videos in this series. The first video is about the Accessible Canada Act. The second video is about accessibility regulations and standards, or rules and guidelines. The third video is about how the Government of Canada, the Canadian Transportation Agency, and the CRTC make accessibility regulations. The fourth video gives tips about how you can give input when new accessibility regulations are being made. This is the 5th video in this series. It talks about where you can find regulations once they are made, and when you might want to use them.
These videos are all available on Arch's website, www.archdisabilitylaw.ca. Each video has a short written summary. These will have the main points of each topic. They will also tell you where to find more information about each topic. You can find these summaries on Arch's website. Arch has found that there are barriers in the process of making these rules. A barrier is anything that does not allow people with disabilities or deaf people to be included in giving input about what these rules should say. A barrier prevents people with disabilities or deaf people from taking part in activities. You can read Arch's recommendations on how to remove barriers here.
Where can people find federal accessibility regulations? Where are these rules published after they are made?
Go to the Government of Canada website. You can search for the names of regulations there. As well, the Canadian Transportation Agency and the CRTC also list their own accessibility regulations on their websites. There are links to these web pages in the written summary of this video. You can find this summary on Arch's website.
Is there anywhere else we could find the regulations?
You can also find federal regulations on a website called CanLII. CanLII is a free online resource. It includes laws, regulations, and legal cases from courts and tribunals across Canada. There is a link to CanLII's search page in the written summary of this video. You can find this summary on Arch's website.
What if someone does not have a computer? What if someone does not have high-speed internet? What if these websites are not accessible? What if the regulations are not in an accessible format?
You should call the government, the agency, or the CRTC and ask them for a paper copy. You can contact the agency for accessible transportation regulations. You can contact the CRTC for accessible radio, television, telephone, and internet regulations. You can contact the government for other types of accessibility regulations. Their telephone numbers are in the written summary on ARCH's website.
What if these websites are not accessible? What if the regulations are not in an accessible format?
You would also contact the government, the agency, or CRTC. Ask them for the regulation in a format that is accessible to you.
You've explained where to find the federal accessibility regulations. Why would somebody want to read them?
Say you come across a barrier while dealing with the federal government, or maybe you find a barrier at a federal business or organization. This might make you want to learn more about accessibility regulations.
Can you give me an example?
Imagine an airline won't let you take your mobility device on an airplane. This may be a barrier. Imagine they won't let you bring your service dog on an airplane. This also may be a barrier. What if something like this happens to you? If it does, you may want to look at the Canadian Transportation Agency's accessibility rules for airlines. This would lead you to the Accessible Transportation for Persons with Disabilities regulations. The Accessible Transportation for Persons with Disabilities regulations may have rules that apply to your situation. These rules may say if airlines have to allow your mobility device on the airplane. They may also say if airlines have to allow service dogs on board. Take a look at the regulations. If you think a rule is not being followed, you can ask for more information from the airline. You may also be able to file a complaint with the Canadian Transportation Agency. You may want to ask the airline for a copy of the airline's accessibility plan. The agency also makes rules about accessibility plans. Airlines have to follow these rules when they make their accessibility plans. Take a look at the plan. Find out if the airline made its plan properly. Make sure its plan follows the rules made by the agency. Find out if the airline has a public feedback process. It might tell you how to let the airline staff know about barriers. It might tell you how to let airline staff know about your accessibility concerns.
Let's talk about another time you might want to look at accessibility regulations. Say you want to help a federal organization make its accessibility plan, or maybe you want to tell them whether they are meeting the goal set out in their plan. This information would be important for organizations' progress reports. Can you tell us about that?
Accessibility regulations will tell you what rules federal government offices, organizations, and businesses have to follow to make accessibility plans. These regulations will tell you when they have to measure their progress. For example, maybe you're interested in how television broadcasters make accessibility plans. You could read the accessibility rules made by the CRTC. These rules will tell you how often broadcasters have to consult with disability and deaf communities about their accessibility plans and progress reports. Here's another example. Say you're interested in accessible communication for people with disabilities and deaf people. Maybe you want to know how a government office, like the CRA, makes its communication accessible. You may find this out by checking the Government of Canada's regulations. These regulations will tell you where the CRA must publish their accessibility plan. You can read the CRA's accessibility plan to find out what it is doing to remove barriers and make its communication more accessible.
Where else could we learn about how federal government offices, organizations, and businesses follow accessibility rules?
You could check whether there is an accessibility standard made by Accessibility Standards Canada. Accessibility standards are voluntary, but government offices, organizations, and businesses may use them when they're deciding how to follow the Act and accessibility regulations. Guidance documents also do not include legal rules. Instead, they may describe best practices that organizations may find helpful to follow a regulation. The CRTC also makes orders, regulatory policies, and codes of conduct. These work together with regulations to help improve accessibility of internet, telephone, television, and radio services.
What if a federal organization breaks the rules? What if they do not follow accessibility regulations? How do we find out their punishment?
Not following accessibility rules can lead to fines. It can also lead to other penalties. The Government of Canada and the Canadian Transportation Agency set these fines and penalties in their regulations. Meanwhile, the CRTC is more likely to deal with enforcement in other ways. For example, it might order an internet provider to remove a certain barrier, or it might set certain conditions for a television broadcaster's license.
If an organization doesn't follow accessibility rules, can someone make a complaint?
The Act puts in place different ways to make a complaint. You can complain if a federal organization, government, or business doesn't follow federal accessibility rules. One way to make a complaint is through the feedback process. The Act says that the Government of Canada, federal businesses, and organizations must have a way to get feedback. You can use this feedback process to make a complaint. You could use it to let them know that there were barriers that they need to remove. In some situations, you can also complain to the Accessibility Commissioner, the Canadian Transportation Agency, or the CRTC. Each of these government agencies has a process to handle complaints. This process is separate from the feedback process that federal government offices, organizations, and businesses must create.
How do you know which agency to complain to?
Say you decide to make a complaint. Who you complain to will depend on several things. It will depend on what your complaint is about, how the barrier affects you, what outcome you want, and whether your complaint is urgent. If a railway, ferry, airline, or interprovincial bus doesn't follow accessibility rules, you can complain to the Canadian Transportation Agency. Say your complaint is about telephone, television, radio, or internet companies not following accessibility rules. These complaints should go to the CRTC. Say your complaint is about federal government services, buildings, and information that doesn't follow accessibility rules. These complaints should go to the Accessibility Commissioner. There are also other agencies that will take complaints about specific accessibility issues. An example would be the Federal Public Sector Labor Relations and Employment Board. The Accessibility Commissioner, the agency, and the CRTC all have their own rules. They will take different types of complaints. Each one has its own complaint process. Some may take longer than others. It may be best to talk to a lawyer before making a complaint. They can give you advice about who it may be best to complain to.
What about the Canadian Human Rights Commission? Do they have a role?
The Canadian Human Rights Commission, or the Commission, existed long before the Act. It hears discrimination complaints brought by people with disabilities and deaf people. These complaints are about federal workplaces, services, or other areas not treating people with disabilities and deaf people equally. Discrimination complaints at the Commission focus on protecting human rights. These complaints are not focused on the Act. They are not focused on violations of accessibility regulations. That said, sometimes a barrier may also be an example of discrimination based on disability. In these situations, you may have a choice about who you complain to. You may be able to complain to the Canadian Human Rights Commission or one of the other three agencies, the Accessibility Commissioner, the Canadian Transportation Agency, or the CRTC.
How does someone know if they should complain to the Canadian Human Rights Commission or one of the other agencies you've talked about?
The short answer is that it really depends on the situation. Each of these complaints starts a different process. Each process has its own specific rules. Some processes may work better than others based on the person's situation. Some may take more time than others. As well, each of these processes have their own outcomes or results. It is a good idea for people to get legal advice to help them decide where to file their complaints. Arch can give you legal information if you live in Ontario. If you do not live in Ontario, Arch will do its best to refer you to someone in your area to help you.
Here are 5 important points to learn from watching this video. First, regulations can be found on federal government websites. They are put there after they are made. They can also be found on the CanLII website. What do you do if you come across a barrier in a federal office, business, or organization? One thing you can do is read their accessibility regulations. These rules may say what they should be doing to get rid of the barrier you experienced. These regulations will give rules for accessibility plans, progress reports, feedback processes, and consultations. They can also help you to understand what the fines or penalties are for breaking these rules. Third, sometimes regulations work together with other rules and guidelines. For example, it's also a good idea to check voluntary standards or guidance documents. These will have best practices. Federal organizations may use these when they decide how to follow the Act and its regulations. If the barrier you experience has to do with radio, television, telephone, or internet services, you could check if the CRTC has other rules and guidelines. These are called orders, regulatory policies, and codes of conduct. Fourth, who do you complain to if a federal organization is not following accessibility rules? Who you complain to depends on what the complaint is about. You may be able to go to the Accessibility Commissioner with your complaint. You would usually go to the Canadian Transportation Agency if the complaint is about federal transportation not following accessibility rules. You would usually go to the CRTC if the complaint is about radio, television, internet, or phone companies not following accessibility rules. Sometimes you can complain to the Canadian Human Rights Commission. This process is separate from the Accessible Canada Act. It's about complaints of discrimination based on disability. Fifth, deciding which of these options to choose will depend on a few things. Some of these things are what your complaint is about, how the barrier has affected you, what outcome you want, and whether it is urgent or not. It's a good idea to get legal advice before you file a complaint. This will help you get as much information as possible. It may help you decide which option is best for you.
Thank you for watching the videos in this series. We hope that these videos have given helpful information about the Accessible Canada Act, its regulations and standards, how people with disabilities can give input when new regulations are made, and how to use accessibility regulations once they are final. For more information, please go to the written summaries of these videos on Arch's website.
Arch thanks the Government of Canada's Social Development Partnerships Program Disability Component for funding this project. The information in these video materials is not intended to be legal advice. Consult a lawyer or legal worker if you need legal advice on a specific matter. The information in this video is current as of March 31st, 2021.